So today we already looked at the first part of this, the early British Empire. This is now the second part, which is the 10-minute history of about the late British Empire by The Great History Matters. Link to the videos down below. But yeah, essentially something I think that's really interesting about the British Empire is its decline, which I know we'll get to. But what I find interesting is that despite being the largest empire in the world, I believe it's especially from like the World War from the 20th century, where they essentially just gave up territory, kind of like their holdings in India. I believe they just drew back, you know, and kind of just left for the most part. I could be wrong. I apologize if I'm wrong, but you know, I have heard like bits and pieces of them essentially pulling out of areas, kind of giving it up, and kind of limiting themselves back to their own borders. And if what I've heard and what if anything I said there's any truth to it, like, or anything correct to it, I should say, is that would make them such a unique empire, because many times the trend is there's a large empire, it slowly gets withered away by opposition and forces until eventually it just completely collapses and burns down until some new type of government or lead, you know, takes control. I think if the English really, or the British, yeah, essentially did just give up and just revert themselves back to, you know, their borders and just continue to exist just as they are, you know, much limited, never really falling per se, you know, like a collapse of their their government or whatnot. I don't know. I just find that a unique diversion compared to the fate of many other nations and kingdoms and empires. But that's if anything I've said is correct. I'm gonna look at this video and see how it all plays out. Oh, first I want to ask you all, if you enjoy anything I say or any of my thoughts or opinions, please like, comment, subscribe to this channel, to this video, etc. It would really help me out a lot, and I would really appreciate it. With that said, without any further ado, let's get to it. Let's watch 10-minute history, the late British Empire, by History Matters.
3. And the Americans have left. The Empire, led by King George III, famous for being crazy, now had to find a new...
There's a movie called The Madness of King George III. I've seen only bits and pieces, but from what I've seen, I was pretty interested in it. And his, you know, madness and whatnot.
Place for a penal colony, and it found one in Australia. So both Australia and New Zealand had been known to Europeans for centuries because of past Dutch explorers. It was Captain James Cook who sailed to both and claimed them for Britain. New South Wales was chosen as Britain's new penal colony, and the first convicts arrived in 1788.
Convicts. That's what I've heard about Australia, that it was a place where you just dumped prisoners or undesirables. I'm not sure if that's completely correct, but that's something like I've heard offhanded. You know, that's where they just dumped all the undesirables or prisoners or stuff. Which is kind of funny to think about.
So in the next year, the French Revolution happened, paving the way for the Napoleonic Wars, which were a British victory. Victory here gave Britain a few new colonies, such as Malta and South Africa. Importantly, it also weakened Britain's great imperial rival, meaning it could increase the size of its empire without much resistance. Which it did. The century following the Napoleonic Wars...
Yeah, the Napoleonic Wars really did give way to Pax Britannica. Yeah, the Pax Britannica, which... Again, like, the way they... that's why I kept thinking that probably the most important battle of the entire Napoleonic Wars really was the Battle of Trafalgar, right? Like, the moment that the British secured naval supremacy, not only did they protect their own borders, but essentially, at the end, especially by defeating Napoleon in the economic warfare he tried to wage, and getting rid of them, or getting rid of that guy, it really did just pave way to just the UK becoming what it did. Like, it really is kind of like such an interesting and pivotal part of their history. And just the world in general. This would go on to affect the world. And the size of the Royal Navy was what ensured Britain's dominance during the period. For example, in 1864, the British hand over 4 times as many screw streamer warships as France, who had the second largest navy. Wow. Oh my gosh, look at those numbers. Yeah, it's no exaggeration when they say Britannia ruled the waves, man. They were... It was wild.
Is known as the Pax Britannica, the British peace, in which Britain was the world's sole superpower. Over the next few decades, Britain, which Ireland had...
Which is wild to think about. They were... Like I said, if any country came close to world domination, it was the British. They probably came the closest to anyone in terms of world domination.
Formerly been incorporated into, seized Guyana, Singapore, Assam, and this territory in India. Britain was helped in these ventures by the East India Company.
Yes, founded by Queen Elizabeth, as we covered in the first video, was independent barring some government oversight, operated on its own military. Wow. It is an extension of the British, but still its own thing, which is interesting. You know, I was always kind of a little bit interested in finding out how the British kind of operated. Like, the size of their empire, as I've said in the first video, I believe it's the largest empire to ever exist. You know, from all parts of the world. And I was wondering, just like, how did they manage all of that? Like, there had to be some independency among these, like, colonies and areas, because, like, news from one end of the world all the way to the getting back to the UK, you know, the main island of Great Britain, would surely have to take forever. Like, getting news, like, we've seen this with, like, other empires, right? Like, especially large ones, like the caliphate, the first few caliphates of the Muslims. Like, the news from one end to the other end of their empire could take weeks or days. What happens here, like, you know, like, surely that would still be a communication thing. And even the Romans were like, this is too big for us. Like, you know, we're gonna split this, like, in half. Granted, I know that it's a bit different, but you know what I mean, right? I would have to imagine there would have to be a lot of leeway or some type of, like, independence to a degree of letting, you know, whatever governors or whatever overseers in a certain area kind of do what they need to do and probably report back to the crown. I'm just speculating, I don't know. But that's something that always interested me. Like, how did they manage? What was the day-to-day administration, operation, and, like, news of how this empire was being run, and, you know, how Parliament or the Crown handled it. I just find it so interesting, you know? Like, the logistics of an empire like this.
Who oversaw Britain's trade with China, mostly in opium. China had previously banned opium, but Britain refused to listen and kept...
Yeah, they essentially turned them into drug addicts by sneaking them, getting people hooked on opium. It's one of those things, I heard this when I was a kid, about the opium wars or whatnot. And I remember even as a kid of being kind of like, oh, like, oh, that's kind of messed up, like, you know? And even to nowadays, I'm like, that's still pretty messed up, but... Again, I guess it shows the more frightening or terrifying side of this empire, right? Especially if you were their enemy.
Importing it anyway because money. In 1839, the Imperial Chinese government seized opium from British ships and destroyed it, which led to armed conflict, which Britain won, gaining lots of money, a continuation of opium selling in Hong Kong. Britain's victory here also gave it huge influence over China's economy, bringing it into what is known as the informal empire. The informal empire consisted of places which weren't directly under British control, but due to military and diplomatic pressure were often coerced into acting in Britain's interests. To the northwest of India, Britain turned its eyes to Afghanistan. On the surface this was for trade, but the major reason was Russia. Britain was afraid that Russia would seize either Afghanistan or Persia, from which it could then invade India. Britain was also worried that Afghanistan would make an alliance with Russia and so invaded. This was a complete disaster and amounted to nothing more than a slaughter of British and Indian troops by the Afghan militias.
Oh wow.
This competition for influence between Britain...
Yeah, I never heard of that conflict. You know, with the British Empire and Afghan. I've never heard of that, so that was completely new to me.
...in Russia is known as the Great Game and spread beyond Asia and into Europe. The Russians...
Like Risk, except people die. You know, I used to play Risk a lot when I was with back in like high school among friends. It got heated, guys. Like, the amount of backstabbing, betrayals, and political intrigue just between us. There are times I thought that would be the death of our friendships because of how brutal and just like cutthroat we became. Good times, good times.
Were increasing their influence in the Balkans, and Britain was worried about Russian dominance there as well. In order to curb Russia, Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire began the Crimean War, which was
the Crimean War. We've covered that too, and essentially leading to Russia taking an L, and Britain and all the rest, you know, getting what they need from there.
A victory for the Allies and slowed the growing Russian power. In North America, Canada was established as a province, and the borders between itself and the US were finalised. Canada later gained autonomy by becoming a dominion, which meant that the colony was self-governing, but foreign policy was left to Britain. Also about this time, the British began to settle New Zealand. At first, the Maori, the natives of...
Okay, the Maori were the natives of New Zealand, and one way they resisted British expansion was to create a monarch, This monarch was elected often from only a few tribes and would negotiate with the British. That is an interesting thing. So, I guess the British just honored the fact that they had a monarch, so they must have known that, so they made a monarch to, I guess, kind of like show that the British, like, oh wait, these guys have a ruler, so we can't just take it all. That's an interesting way to resist the British.
Of New Zealand were fine with the Europeans as they brought trade to them, but eventually it dawned on them that the Europeans weren't going to stop coming. This led to war, which the British won, leading to more European settlement. In contrast to populating New Zealand, Ireland faced one of the greatest depopulations in human history thanks to the potato famine, which decimated potato.
Not potato. The British potato famine was caused by a disease which killed potato plants. Since the Irish were reliant on potatoes for food, this severely reduced the amount of food to go around. Ireland's population halved due to starvation and immigration, mostly to the United I know it's coming back to me. I've heard of this. I must have heard about this a long time ago, like 4th grade, or I'm pretty sure it was 4th to 5th grade. That was kind of the 4th to 5th grade were the years that I think most stuff about like facts like about this point in history popped up in my head. It's been a while, so it's hard to recall everything from the top of my head, but this is all familiar. This is coming back to me now.
Harvests. The British forced the Irish to grow cash crops, which meant that there was less space to grow food there. The Irish grew potatoes since they had such a high caloric yield for the space they took up. When the famine struck, it was made worse by the British government, who ordered that food would still be exported from Ireland to Britain and that aid would be limited. Ireland's population dropped by half and still has yet to recover to its pre-1800 levels. All the way back
Oh my goodness.
In India, Britain, specifically the independent East India Company, was having some trouble. So background. The East India Company's military was mostly staffed by sepoys, who were Indian troops who served under British officers. These sepoys became increasingly unhappy as they...
Yeah, that seemed like it could come back to bite you, right? I think of like the Diadochi Hellenized area post-Alexander, pre-Roman domination, And one point that got me really interested is that I believe a lot of these, like, Macedonian Greek rulers didn't relied a lot on settlers from Macedon, Greek settlers, to make up a large part of their armies, especially their phalanxes. And there were times, like in the Battle of Raphia, for example, between Antiochus III and Ptolemy, whatever. I forget the specific number, but point is, Ptolemy and Antiochus went to war, and one key point of note was that Ptolemy recruited natives into his phalanx and whatnot, and which was pretty, uncommon, not having so much settlers from the Greeks. And eventually I had heard that this led to the native Egyptians being like, hey, why don't we just rebel? And it kind of goes to show, like, hey, these foreign overlords are now reliant on us. We have the power, like, in a sense. It was kind of like a dawning moment, and that's why they were pretty ill at ease at recruiting so many natives, especially to such a big pivotal aspects. At least that's kind of what I've heard. I'm not sure if that's all correct or not, but I think that kind of general idea kind of seems to resonate here. Is like, oh, if you're making so much of your army from the natives who are under you, eventually there's gonna come a point where where discontentment's gonna grow, and there's gonna be like, why don't we just get rid of them, since we're kind of the majority of the army. Yeah, so like I said with the Diadochi, I not to say they didn't use natives, but I don't believe they were, like, at the core of certain armies, Could be completely wrong, though. I apologize if I am, but that's kind of like stuff I've heard and offhandedly seen, but yeah, I think that general idea would apply here, right?
Their treatment worsened. Their pay stagnated, and they were also forced to fight abroad despite British promises that they wouldn't have to. British policy in India had also led to massive change.
Okay, at first the British did not intervene in matters of Indian religion or social order. The British later banned the practice of sati, whereby a wife would throw herself onto her husband's funeral. Oh my goodness. Funeral pyre. The British also banned polygamy, child marriage, and outlawed slavery in the 19th century. I kind of agree with this. Normally I'm like, oh, you shouldn't impede upon a foreign culture, tolerance and whatnot, but having women not burn themselves alive, banning child marriage, outlawing slavery, I kind of agree with all of this, So this is one of the few times where I'm like, yes, I agree, but still, at the end, it is still the way the Indians practice their culture, regardless of how I feel about this, and regardless of how much I agree with these changes, at the end, it still angers the people, right? Because, like, you're impeding on the way they want to run their society.
Changes in its society as well, which upset many of those living there. For example, the British levied heavy taxes and did nothing to protect the Indian textile industry. The British were also arbitrarily grabbing more and more territory, which understandably made some Indian rulers nervous. Furthermore, the British were also keen proselytizers, and many Hindus and Muslims felt that the British wanted to convert all of India to Christianity. None of this endeared the British to the Indians, and in 1857 the Sepoys revolted against the East India Company. One Sepoy, called Mangal Pandey, mutinied against the British by assaulting some officers, and his execution made him a martyr. The earlier British defeat in Afghanistan also gave confidence to the Indians, since it meant that the British could be defeated. The actual rebellion began when Indian troops...
The Sepoy Revolt. Musket cartridges were made from paper and contained gunpowder, and a shot for loading a musket. In order to load the rifle, a Sepoy would have to bite open the cartridge, pour the gunpowder down, the barrel and then ram the paper-covered shot down the barrel. The grease, often animal fat or beeswax, was used as lubricant that made the loading easier.
Were issued with ammunition coated in either pig or beef fat, which offended both the Muslim and Hindu sepoys. When they refused to use the ammunition, the British arrested them and they, alongside others, mutinied. The rebelling sepoys seized some cities, including Delhi, but eventually the British were able to defeat them. The reasons for this were that only a few Indian states actually joined the rebellion, many were neutral, and support for the British remained strong. One reason for this was that the concept of being Indian didn't really exist. India is an exceptionally diverse place, and a Muslim from Bengal or a Sikh from Punjab had...
Yeah, that's the thing. When we've covered the Indian, the Indian area of the world, like in map videos, like the history of the world, or whenever we've gone to India and battled, it's often very fractured. There are multiple empires, Mughals, or not Muggles, but point is, there are often many empires and kingdoms within this area, all splintered, never one whole united thing through most of the videos we've seen of the past history. So it makes sense why they wouldn't have one national identity, right? Coming from different kingdoms and empires. So that makes a lot of sense.
little in common with a Hindu from Delhi. Another reason for the rebellion's failure was that it was not a pre-planned, politically backed uprising, and the British had much better organisation.
At Granger,
the cost incurred in money, prestige and lives led the British Crown to take control of the running of India, and the East India Company was dissolved in 1858 and Queen Victoria was proclaimed the Empress of India. The British also gained more land from the Indians, removing disloyal chiefs called Nawabs from power. Britain's dominance over its colonies was secured by increasing technological advancements brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Some of the most important of these advancements were the steam-powered ship, trains, the telegram and more advanced firearms. This dominance wouldn't last forever, and towards the end of the century Britain found itself with new rivals. These were the United States, which was recovering from its civil war, the newly unified Germany...
Yes, the technological advancements would help a lot, especially this hologram. That kind of answers some of my thoughts earlier. But I was talking more like previously, you know what I mean? But still, impressive to run something this huge.
Empire and a rising Japan which was looking to carve up Asia. The new German Empire wanted colonies of its own and so turned to Africa. This worried the British, and in order to soothe tensions, the Berlin Conference was called to divide up Africa in a way that avoided war. So Africa went from looking like this to this, with Britain and France getting the lion's share. So the British public's response to imperialism was mixed. Outright opposition to colonialism was very rare. Most people's attitude sat between apathy and a deep pride in Britain's role as a colonial power. This was primarily due to the belief that Britain was a civilizing force. So Britain's conquest of Africa was not a simple...
Yeah, just the colonialism of Africa is a pretty famous thing of how all the great powers just took part in just carving up this entire continent for themselves and remained there even up to like the 20th century, you know?
...and straightforward affair. Britain had substantial military advantages over the Africans it was conquering, such as rifles, machine guns and gunboats. Yet many Africans were able to win victories against the British, such as the Zulus, who slaughtered the British at the Battle of Izam.
There's actually a movie about the Zulus, and... excuse me. But yeah, kind of famous, the most famous Zulu I can think of is Shaka Zulu, and... yes, the Zulu Empire resided in southern Africa and bordered British territory. The Zulus would often forsake firearms for more traditional weapons such as spears and cowhide shields. Ultimately, British technological superiority forced the Zulus to capitulate in just 3 months. The fact that they got any victory at all is kind of amazing, considering that, you know.
And Awana. On the same day, the British won one of its best-known battles, the Battle of Rorke's Drift. Another group of Africans, the Boers, who were originally Dutch settlers.
Okay, the Boers, during the First Boer War, they managed to defeat the British and maintain their independence. This was because, unlike the Zulus, the Boers were very proficient with firearms. The Boers lived in 2 nations, the Free Orange State and the Republic of Transvaal.
settlers also resisted
Transvaal?
British expansion in
Transvaal.
South Africa. In order to defeat Boer guerrilla warfare by denying them shelter, the British placed many women and children into concentration camps where they faced horrible conditions. The conquest of Africa was short and was pretty much complete after 30 years, with only Ethiopia and Liberia remaining independent. The southern colonies in Africa were unified into South Africa, which alongside Australia and New Zealand became a dominion, just like Canada. The empire grew to its territorial height after the First World War, where Britain gained sizable Ottoman and German territory. It wasn't all gains for Britain though, as throughout the war Britain's hold on Ireland became untenable and Ireland became an independent republic in 1922. From the crumbling Ottoman Empire, the British gained Palestine, which it was decided would become a home for the world's Jewish people. Hundreds of thousands of Jews arrived in Palestine over the next couple of decades, and their increasing numbers and political powers there.
Okay, the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was a declaration by the British government that it would support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. The declaration angered the Arabs in the region, who Britain had convinced to rebel against the Ottoman Empire since they believed Palestine would be theirs.
Caused several revolts against the British, all of which were suppressed. After the Second World War, many more arrived and the tensions rose again, culminating in a civil war and the creation of Israel. So, the Second World War was a British victory, but had brought Britain to the brink of economic ruin. Indians had been seeking independence from Britain since about 5 minutes after it turned up. Many Indians felt that their contribution to both world wars meant that they were owed independence. In 1937...
Okay, the Indian National Congress led by... I'm not going to try to pronounce that. They were advocates for Indian independence and were strongly opposed to India's participation in World War II. Their main opponents were the Muslim League, which won many seats but did not win any regions.
India held elections in which the Indian National Congress, an advocate for independence, won the largest share of the seats. Furthermore, the famine of 1943...
The Bengal famine. The famine was caused by the Japanese seizure of Burma, which was a breadbasket for India, which caused a food shortage, which the British refused to alleviate. Instead of sending food to Bengal, regional governors prevented food from being exported. That's wild. And the famine was made worse, much worse, when grain from Australia was redirected to Egypt.
Which was caused mostly by Britain diverting food away from India, had cost the lives of many millions, increasing demands for the end of British rule. The most famous opponents to the British were Mohandas Gandhi and Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
Yeah, Gandhi. I believe a big part was he fasted as kind of known for his peaceful approach to I believe the British presence that's the big one, and fasting. Eventually his efforts actually succeeded in the long run, if I could remember correctly, but he's obviously a very famous historical figure.
Gandhi was not a politician, but was very important since he practiced a non-violent approach. Jinnah is famous for advocating that India be divided so that Muslims could have their own state as well. In 1947, India gained its independence and was subsequently divided into India and Pakistan. Britain was unable to fight this tide due to its weakness. It simply couldn't afford to force India to stay. Furthermore, Clement Attlee, Britain's post-war Prime Minister, was sympathetic to the Indian cause. The division of India was not so peaceful though, and it is believed that during the mass migration, ethnic cleansing and fighting that occurred afterwards, as many as 2 million people died. In the aftermath of World War II, Britain found itself opposed by two anti-imperialist superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Slowly but surely, over the course of the 20th century, colonies broke away from British rule, some violently, some peacefully. A notable example of British imperial retreat is Kenya. Kenya had been run similarly to most other colonies.
Tens of thousands of Indians settled in Kenya and formed a second tier of citizen. Many were employed as laborers of household staff. They were permitted to settle on better land than most Kenyas.
Colonies, with white settlers owning lots of land, amassing wealth and forcing horrible working conditions on the natives. Many Kenyans, notably Jomo Kenyatta, attempted to get reforms from the British, all of which were refused. Some Kenyans then turned to violence, and what is known as the Mau Mau uprising began. The Mau Mau resorted to guerrilla warfare, but the British were able to suppress the uprising after capturing its leaders. Both sides committed horrendous war crimes, including torture and the murder of women and children. In 1960, Britain announced that it would move towards an independent Kenya, and in 1963, Kenya gained its independence with Kenyatta as its first president. Britain's motives for this were simple. The writing was on the wall and the empire was going to end. Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of Britain, made sure that the handover of power was swift to help promote good relations between.
Okay, the Commonwealth of Nations was formed to help mend relations and improve economic ties with Britain's former colonies. It was hoped that close ties with the Commonwealth would improve Britain's international authority. Some, such as Ireland, refused to join.
Between Britain and its former colonies. Decolonisation would continue for the next several decades until Britain's last major colony, Hong Kong, was handed back to China in 1997, thus marking the end of the empire. So in conclusion,
yeah, that's wild. Like, you know, Great Britain is still just chilling. Like, unlike most other empires, which usually, obviously, it did shrink like every other major empire, but usually upon the shrinkage kind of comes a type of collapse and, you know, essentially something changes. It just shrunk back to more of its earlier borders, just relegated back to its island, you know, and it's just chilling there to this day, you know. It's still there, and that's a very interesting aspect. Like the empire didn't go out with some bang like some other ones. It's just withered, you know, which is such an interesting aspect compared to other empires, and the fact it's just still chilling, which is pretty cool. But yeah.
the legacy of the British Empire is undeniable. One only needs to look at a map of countries that drive on the left, play cricket or rugby, or still have the British monarch as their head of state. Opinions on the empire range from it being a civilising force to an oppressive one. What can be said for definite is that without the empire, the world would have looked very different today. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you.
Yeah. I really like that video, guys. Like, wait, let me drink. Apologies. But yeah, that's really an interesting aspect. I obviously was aware of the British Empire, largest empire I believe in the world. I think it is a fact. I keep saying I believe, but I'm pretty sure it is a fact. I just like to be incredibly cautious with what I say, but I'm always second guessing myself, you know, but you know, I never had a full, comprehensive, overall view of its formation to where it is now. And I feel like I finally have that in my head, which makes me really happy to see the full picture, not just bits and pieces and chunks, like I did previously. So overall, this was really great. I enjoyed this. If you enjoyed anything I had to say, please like, comment, subscribe. It would help me a lot. Help this channel a lot. I really want to grow. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.